Madam Speaker, when Second Affirmative got up here and told you that the Taliban didn't burn women at the stake, she was right. What they did was in the football stadium in the centre of Kabul, they dragged women who had been victims of rape in. They were then proceeded to be hung until they were almost dead. They were then beaten and whipped. But before they were even dead, they were then paraded around that stadium in front of hundreds and thousands of people. They were then shot in the head. This was all televised on state media. That's what happened to women under the Taliban. It wasn't a fringe extreme group that persecuted women. It was the Taliban, and they did it in the centre of the capital of Kabul. And it was Kabul. We reject the idea that there are somehow minorities existing all around Afghanistan. The Taliban military went in with US and Soviet arms and massacred them all. They massacred huge numbers of Hazaras in the north, a minority. We think that the Taliban wasn't just maybe bad. We don't think that the stability that they wanted to point to is any justification for the horrors that the Taliban enforced upon the people of Afghanistan. So, I'm going to talk to you about three issues in rebuttal. One, how's terrorism, two, Western imperialism, and long-term development will come nicely into my substantive. Okay, terrorism. The first week I want to talk about three issues of why our war on terror through Afghanistan has been ineffectual. So she talked about civilian Afghanistan and civilian deaths. My first speaker dealt with this adequately when he told you the fact that we had children dying, a 75% mortality rate that is now less than 20%. They also talked about how this hasn't prevented terrorism, and they told us that they are now in Pakistan and somehow have nukes. The war on terrorism did one really important thing. It has stopped all state-sponsored terrorism. What Al-Qaeda was a state-sponsored terrorism. We think when the US, the most powerful army in the world, goes into a country and that says, we will invade you if you support terrorism, you strike fear into the heart of every single country that they will never support terrorism in the future. And we saw that change. Pakistan, pre-US invasion, was an ally of the Taliban. We think since that US invasion, the Pakistani people have consecutively voted in pro-US, pro-war on terror governments. Why? Because state-sponsored terrorism is now evil. Because they know if they in any way sponsor terrorism, the US will come after them. And such that terrorism can't be protected by states anymore, and they are forced to be on the run. And we have successfully done that. Okay, then they also talk about their sympathy from governments, and therefore they've found bases in Yemen. First of all, Yemen, we're not entirely sure if that government's very stable, but also that government has now succeedingly, over the years, distanced itself further and further from terrorism to the point that they are now cooperating with the US and providing intel on where those terrorists are. One, because they've seen that the US is not afraid to invade a country to get those terrorists. So now every country in the world has an incentive to get those terrorists too, because the US will come and do it for you if you don't do it. And we think that that's something that they never wanted to deal with on the affirmative. Okay. They also said we've failed to prevent terrorism. Ladies and gentlemen, since the US invaded Afghanistan, there has been no major terrorist attack on US soil. There has been no 9/11 2.0. There has been no 33,000 deaths in one morning. That hasn't happened again. We think we have been successful in preventing some forms of terrorism, and that we continue to be successful with the long-term ways that we have it. They also then said that we have expended all our political capital with the war on terror. First of all, we think we've expended on something a worthwhile goal in stopping state-sponsored terrorism that were threats to all Western countries that disagree with their ideology. But first of all, we think it's created more capital. And it's created more capital and that's created a precedence that if a state sponsors terrorism, the US will go in. That any terrorist group is a target. And we think it's created capital and it's created movement to attack further terrorist groups, as we're seeing with the US moving on groups such as Al-Shabaab. Okay. Then they want to tell us that Westerners don't actually like the war on terror, that they see this torture and they don't like it. Then how come after Osama bin Laden was killed, Obama's approval ratings went through the roof? We think what Westerners don't like is the fact that Western troops get killed trying to get these terrorists. We think that Westerners like their security, and they think that anything is worth their security. We think the priority of a Western country goes the security of its civilians, and then the human rights of their enemies. And we think we are happy to preface the safety of Western liberal citizens over these terrorists. Okay. Then we have that idea of Western imperialism she wanted to talk about. So first of all, she told us that the Taliban manages to motivate itself completely off the fact that they can point to a US tank and go, that's the reason why you're suffering. Completely ignored the fact that these people have been oppressed brutally for 10 years by these people and somehow going to switch to them because the Taliban can point to a US tank. We don't see that logic. Second of all, we also think that we are killing those recruiters, that we are successfully killing them, so we don't particularly care that the Taliban can point to a US tank when we can kill that Taliban person. Okay, then they said that hearts and minds were essential in order to change things, and that you needed to do hearts and minds. First of all, we think that a US change of hearts and minds is never going to do it. It has to be a change organically from those Afghani people, which you do by liberating them, which you do at the moment. Where, like, women can go to school and form their own opinions. We don't think that we should be telling Afghani people, this is what you have to believe, and trying to win their hearts and minds. We think we should be allowing them to make their own opinions by liberating them, not being Western imperialists and saying, we must win your hearts and minds, this is what you must think. So on to my substantive. Why the Karzai government and why the current government in Afghanistan is more stable and thus better for the people than the Taliban. Okay, why is it more stable? One, it has the power to enforce law. So that's obvious. Like, it has a police and army under its control, and it can use them with effect. Second of all, it holds elections and has an open parliament. Thirdly of all, oppressed people by the Taliban have been liberated. So we're talking about minorities, we're talking about women, we're talking about ordinary civilians who can never speak out. We think that these people now have the power to, if they wanted to, form powerful opposition groups to this government, if they chose that that government wasn't what they wanted. The fact that we don't have these powerful opposition groups, the fact that they're actually forming coalitions within those parliaments, shows that they're happy with this form of government. Okay. Four, we think that the fact that Karzai government is working with minority groups and that minority groups are supporting this government shows that this government has the respect of the people, because we don't think minority groups would necessarily interact with a Western puppet, but they would interact with a government that has their respect. So we think that when the tribal leaders of Uruzgan rural areas are willing to deal with the Karzai government and willing to do with them, they have accepted one thing, that government is here to stay, and two, that they respect that government and its ability to do things. Three, and then this idea of the economy. They wanted to tell us how the economy of Afghanistan was destroyed with this war. We question what their economy was with the Taliban. It was opium poppies. We don't think that's necessarily something that we're sorry to have destroyed. And we think the fact that most of the people in Afghanistan were starving and living off mouldy bread, we're not completely sad that we've destroyed their economy. We think what they have now is a large amount of foreign investment, indicated by the fact that the Russians are pouring millions and millions of dollars into creating gas pipelines through Afghanistan. They wouldn't take that risk with their capital of building these pipelines through Afghanistan if they didn't think that country was stable, if they didn't think that government would last. They would have no incentive to risk that capital. So we think, one, their economy is being rebuilt. But two, we think that this foreign investment shows the stability and faith that that government has inspired in people, that it's not a Western puppet, that Russia, not a Western ally, is willing to see that government and deal with that government because they're not a Western puppet. Okay, we admit the Karzai government isn't perfect, but it's better than the Taliban. We think they do things that the Taliban never ever did. They invest in their people. They build hospitals. The fact that a woman can now go to a hospital and isn't shot for trying to get in the door is a very, very meaningful change. The fact that they build up infrastructure. The fact that there are roads. The fact that people can now move around the country. The fact that there is electricity in over half of Afghanistan, where it was only in 20% of it before. But the fact that they are educating people. We think that a stable government is a government that doesn't need to oppress people in order to maintain power like the Taliban did. That's not a stable government. We think a stable government is the one we see now that's happy to educate everybody because it knows that it has nothing to fear from those people because they're not going to oppress those people. Where everybody, women, minorities, everybody is educated. So ladies and gentlemen, because we think that the Karzai government and because the government we have now is better than the Taliban ever was, because life under the Taliban was hell, and a hell we were never ever happy to support, we're happy to stand by the US invasion. Thank you.